With victories by Whitman, Fiorina, Lincoln, Sharron Angle in Nevada, Nikki Haley strong showing in South Carolina, maybe a new narrative is forming, one that the media could perhaps take note of and diminish simultaneously.
The night went to the ladies.
We've been hearing everything from girl power to chicks rule.
Last night really was ladies' night.
Ladies' night.
Ladies' night.
Hear me roar. Woman power. Woman power. Power to the women.
Imagine that. What do you think? Imagine that. Dame's in charge. I mean, come on.
Well, the Daily Show summing it all up for us, as so often happens. Welcome back, Katrina and Melissa. So glad to have you here at the Nation on Grid TV. Let's start with the framing. Was this just the media's attempt desperately to reboot after their, vitriol against insiders failed to pan out?
Well, first of all, I will not roar, I promise, but I am thrilled to launch the Nation with Grid TV with two great women. I think the media is always seeking a narrative, an easy narrative. They found in the number of women running this simplistic narrative. I think we are going to live with this, and we need to look through the co-optation of feminist thinking packaged in a very slick way by Sarah Palin, her Mama Grizzlies, many of these candidates. They're peddling anti-women policies. And so you're not going to get it from the mainstream media, so your show's going to have a lot to work with, as will the Nation.
Melissa, you think this isn't just a blip?
Well, yeah, I think we have to pause and mention that part of the challenge of identity politics is precisely this question about identity and ideology. It does matter when there are more women in office. It matters from a purely symbolic standpoint about the question of citizenship. Sometimes I'm asked, wouldn't I prefer to have an all-white Supreme Court as long as Clarence Thomas wasn't there, given that obviously Clarence Thomas and I agree on nothing in terms of policy. But I must say that the answer is no. I would not prefer to have an all-white Supreme Court. That having racial diversity on the court, just as having gendered diversity within our leadership, matters at the pure level of who is a citizen, who has a right to run, who has a right to express their ideas. On the other hand, the limits of identity politics are always that feminism and woman are not the same thing. And so ladies' night does not mean triumph for feminism.
Let me just remind our viewers of one of the women that we're talking about, the winner of a primary contest. It's not an election yet. These are just primaries. Here's Carly Fiorina speaking on Meet the Press this weekend.
Let me first say that I've never been in politics before. I've never run for office. But I think our founding fathers intended this to be a citizen government. It's what of, by, and for the people means. And what I sense in the state of California is a lot of people agree with me. And they think that the lessons we learn in the real world would help in Washington. Common sense, problem-solving ability, actions speak louder than words, results count. Those are things that people want to see more of in Washington.
Now, Carly Fiorina won the primary to run against Barbara Boxer. You wrote about her this week,
I
Katrina.
did. There's so much going on here because Melissa speaks so wisely about the limits of identity politics. You're also seeing here the limits of outsider politics. For Carly Fiorina to call herself an outsider is obscene. Is laughable because you have two women, Meg Whitman using her fortune. She's already spent $80 million. Carly Fiorina already $5 million. How are very rich CEOs outsiders? She talks about citizenship. We do want a level playing field in this country. You wrote about it well in your book, Blue Grit. You want women. You want people of all kinds able to enter the democratic process. But Carly Fiorina's money has unleveled the playing field. And also this idea of life experience, which she did as CEO, which I wrote about at thenation.com, was preside over massive layoffs. She was a job killer, not a job creator. Outsourcing jobs overseas, and also presided over a merger which led her to be called by Portfolio magazine, No Radical magazine, the 19th worst CEO in the country, up there with Ken Lay of Enron and Richard Fuld. So there's a lot to work with.
The point in your piece, Katrina, in the magazine, that this is a woman who was drawing down a salary of $100 million at a time she was laying off 28,000, I think disproportionately female workers, although I might be wrong about that. One of the points, though, that you're making, and that I also saw made in an editorial in the New York Times, was whatever you may think of the individual women, I think the word was, if you're looking for a watershed moment where the women's movement finally came, into its own, this is now because people are voting for women who are moms, women who are business owners, et cetera, in a way that maybe they didn't before.
Well, it's interesting to frame it as a watershed moment for the women's movement because it will require us to recognize the limitations of what has always been the women's movement when it is defined by those who are privileged women. So this probably is a watershed for the privileged woman's or bourgeois woman's movement. And of course, the whole point of feminist movements is that they have been challenged on the left by women who are laborers, by women who are immigrants, by women of color, by African American domestic workers who were in the homes when bourgeois white women went to work. So in fact, at all points, the notion that simply the identity woman, the potential of having been born with a uterus and ovaries is sufficient to mean similar political interests, I think is wrong. And so in that sense, it is the culmination of a movement that has always been complicated.
I mean, you've got to wonder, what about the women constituents? What about women voters? What about women in the country who aren't these multimillionaires?
Well, I think speaking without any patronizing tone, I do think you're seeing women vote for women who are pushing, again, peddling policies that will hurt women. If you think about the majority of them, I put Blanche Lincoln of Arkansas aside for a moment, though she's a conservative Democrat, but many of these women are running on anti-government platforms. One of them in Nevada wants to cut all these programs that have disproportionately helped women, Social Security, Medicare. And you are seeing a perversion, it seems to me, of what even the women's movement means in this country. They're against pay equity. They blame it on women's career choices, many of them, for what is a systemic structural problem in our society. Again, I come back to the media. I think it's going to be a narrative the mainstream media wants to peddle, even though, as you know, you've seen that I think only 7 of 104 Republican women are being supported by the National Republican Congressional Committee. But you're also going to have someone like Greta Van Susteren of Fox turning to Sarah Palin and asking her about whether she has fake implants and you won't see much discussion of her fake populism. So again, there's going to be a lot of work to be done because it's a sexy narrative.
Well, but remember, again, this is part of what identity politics always does, is it assumes that anyone whose voting record is contrary to the identity group from which they emerge. It assumes that they are therefore independent thinkers. We saw the same thing, for example, with Colin Powell as a potential Republican nominee for the U.S. presidency, although it never emerged in the late 90s. But the idea that as a military man and as a Republican, he wasn't bound by race. It's part of what made the election of Barack Obama so extraordinary. It wasn't even so much the election of a black man, but a black man in the Democratic Party, which was so surprising. I'd expected us, in fact, to elect a person of color, to elect a white woman as president, but I certainly thought that it would have come from the Republican Party because there's always this assumption that if you are against the interests of the majority of the individuals in the group from which you emerge, that you are therefore an independent thinker.
But Melissa picks up on something interesting because I think there's much more attention by our mainstream media to the right-wing women. Just in the same way we've seen the Tea Party movement inflated. And there's too little attention to the women who are running on peace and justice, social justice
There's
platforms.
There's a woman in Iowa, Roxanne Conlon,
who has a real chance against Grassley.
Coverage.
And there was so I think we need to bring attention to those women and bring attention to those women in Congress, it seems to me. Whether one likes or dislikes Nancy Pelosi, she has been fighting a tough fight to push a bigger health care reform. There are so many good women who don't get the attention. Thinking of Donna Edwards, Barbara Lee, Shelley Pingree. Where is the narrative about those women and what they have accomplished in these last
good question.
6, 8, 10 years?
While the clock keeps ticking, I do want to mention a couple of things. One is some kudos to the Nation magazine and the Nation Institute, along with ProPublica and a few others, for the reporting that has, it seems, led to federal indictments against 5 police officers in a fatal shooting in New Orleans right after Katrina, September of 2005. I want to just remind our audience of the Henry Glover case.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think this is why I'm in journalism, but the work you do brings justice. And in the wake of Hurricane Katrina, there was a spate of vigilante killings. We brought in an investigative reporter, A.C. Thompson, who spent a lot of time, 18 months more in New Orleans, pushing to get records that the coroner in New Orleans said were not available. And as a result of our investigative work, we've led the Times-Picayune to do more on police brutality in New Orleans. And now, as you said, there are indictments. And I think Henry Glover's family is very moved and pleased to see some justice.
Is this big news in New Orleans, your hometown, Melissa?
Well, I got to say, New Orleans right now is facing so many challenges. The Gulf Coast oil disaster is, as we are right now at the start of hurricane season, just bracing the city. And in many ways, I want to say the city is so focused on what might even be happening over the course of the next 5 years as we're looking at this new ecological disaster. And the city, I think, in many ways wanting to heal after the past 5 years in the post-Katrina era, that unfortunately sometimes moments like this get lost in that bridge between wanting to heal and looking forward to the new challenges. But I will say there's no question that poor communities, marginal communities, black communities are still facing the fundamental challenges of their relationship with the New Orleans Police Department.
Melissa Harris-Lacewell and Katrina vanden Heuvel will put links to A.C. Thompson's reporting and his appearance on this show at our website, grittv.org. Thank you both.
Thank you.
A whole lot more to come.